Yes. That's the video, thanks for watching. Okay, there's more to it than that. If this question transported you back to the online racism discourse of the late 2010s, you're not the only one. But no, this question actually came up in a modern event. So, David Scott Jaffe, best known for directing Twisted Metal and God of War back in the day, now runs a YouTube channel discussing gaming from a very left-wing point of view. He had on a guest, Alyssa Mercante, a games journalist whose biggest claim to fame is probably her involvement with the whole Sweet Baby Inc. fiasco from last year. If you hang out in any anti-woke gaming spaces online, you probably already know these two people pretty well. Well, they took call-ins during that show, and I managed to get on for a few minutes, but there wasn't enough time to actually talk about anything of substance. I don't necessarily blame them, that's just the nature of a call-in show. You want to get through as many callers as you can. But hey, there's no reason that I can't drill down on something I believe they're wrong about in my own.
What did you say? White people, you can't be racist against white people, which is technically accurate. Just like it is accurate to say what I say, which I get shit for, which is not very clever. It's everybody says it that is aware of this stuff, which is all white people in America are racist. It doesn't mean you don't like black people.
No.
It means that if you're white, you benefit from systemic racism that has built this country. I assume what you were saying was because white people are in a power position, you can be bigoted against white people. You can hate white people if you're a black person or whatever, but you can't by definition be racist because part of the definition of racist includes an ownership of power and a control over people that are looked at as lesser.
Like I said, if you've been around the internet for a while, you've probably heard this before. Jaffe expanded on this idea on Twitter, where he said that Obama's kids, being rich kids, can be hateful and bigoted towards poor white people, but they can't be racist towards white people if you're discussing racism the way that it would/should be discussed. Historical, intellectual, political level power structures. But yes, for sure, if you go by the simple and sadly often used definition of racism, anyone can be racist against another person. But at that point, you are really just talking garden variety bigotry and hate. But it, like racism, like many terms, has been simplified and reduced to a soundbite. The claim here is that per the colloquial definition of racism, which is just racial prejudice or hatred, anyone can be racist towards anyone else. But the real definition of racism requires not only racial hatred, but the power to implement that hatred onto your target. Jaffe's argument appears to be that while the colloquial definition is common, and in fact most people under his tweet or in the comments of that video clip are arguing for the colloquial definition, the true definition is more complicated. It's more of a product of education, and that the colloquial users are using the term wrong. They don't know how it was originally used, which Jaffe, to his credit, points out that this attitude often stems from leftist elitism. However, I have the same progressive education as they do. They're progressives and I'm not, and I think I can show how they're just incorrect about this. First, as always with any definition discussion, we begin with the root word. Racism was first used by a Richard Henry Pratt in 1902, when he said, segregating any class or race of people apart from the rest of the people kills the progress of the segregated people, or makes their growth very slow. Association of races and classes is necessary to destroy racism and classism. Now, this guy had some other things to say about racism, but let's set that aside for later. This is when the word racism was coined in the English language. Most words that are formed by the addition of prefixes or suffixes begin as colloquial words before becoming officially a part of the language. In this case, the word race comes from the Italian word razza, which means breed or lineage. Pratt attached the suffix ism, which basically means of the subject, and it comes from the Greek gendered suffixes of ismo and isma. Pretty much every European language inherited these suffixes, which is why, for example, in Spanish you have machismo. The ismo bit comes from Greek. The original definition of the word racism was of a noun describing the state of being racist. Racist at this time meant a person who subscribes to the belief that humans can or should be classified into racial groups, which each have natural differences in abilities or dispositions. This belief system could include, but didn't have to include, the view that some races were superior to others, justifying differential treatment, or the view that a political ideology in which privileges are distributed based on these racial categories is the moral thing to do. The word racism described this belief system. This history of the word's definition comes out of Webster's 9th edition dictionary. But most importantly for us, nothing in here talks about power in the way that Jaffe and Mercante use the word. Despite Jaffe's insistence that the real definition includes this extra qualifier, the colloquial definition for him seems to be the original one. The question then is, well, where did they get their interpretation for the word racist? It's not exactly rare. You can find people all over the internet posting what is basically their view in a more simplified form, that racism is prejudice plus power. So where did this come from? The 2017 book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, calls the prejudice plus power definition of racism unattributed, which doesn't really help us, but it does describe it in a bit more detail. Everyone has the capacity to be nasty to other people, but there simply aren't enough black people in positions of power to enact racism against white people on the kind of grand scale it currently operates against black people. The idea presented here is that racism is not simply when a member of race A prejudges race B, and then treats a member from race B with nastiness stemming from that judgment. No, it requires some form of social power to truly be racism. This idea had not yet fully formed when the African-American social scientist Oliver Cox wrote in 1948, "If beliefs per se could subjugate a people, the beliefs which Negroes hold about whites should be as effective as those that whites hold about Negroes." In the 1998 book Confronting Racism, Cox's off-the-cuff assertion is analyzed. The universality of in-group bias presents a paradox for understanding racism. If all people display in-group bias, then what drives the enduring oppression of some, but not all, human groups, specifically minority racial groups? A resolution to this paradox lies in Cox's assertion to forces beyond the individual level of analysis. Other sections of this book do indeed show that all racial groups show an in-group preference, whites preferring whites, blacks preferring blacks, and so on, meaning that something else has to be behind racism persisting. And while the book does talk about how adding power to prejudice transforms universal psychological processes into asymmetrical social processes, this is not the source of the definition of racism being prejudice plus power. In order to really get to the bottom of this, we have to go back to 1970 and Patricia A. Bidall, who published a book meant to instruct educators on this topic, titled Developing New Perspectives on Race, an innovative multimedia social studies curriculum in race relations for the secondary level. At the time, she was a high school superintendent in Michigan. At some point, her name changed to Patricia Bidall Padva, probably due to marriage, but she spent the majority of her career in the education system. And hey, she's still going. Here she is in 2022 speaking on the YouTube channel of the NTL Institute for Applied Behavioral Science, 50 years after publishing the book.
I'm 81. So in the early 1970s, I was the executive director of an organization called New Perspectives in Race in Detroit. It was created after the 1967 race rebellions. And our mission was to look at the elimination of white racism at a systemic level in schools and communities in Detroit. And we also very quickly became known and were asked to move to places like Brownsville and in the New York area.
Now, I couldn't actually find a real-life copy of this book, or an online PDF or anything like that. It is at a few other universities according to some interlibrary services, including the one I graduated from, which does make sense because I distinctly remember a friend actually checking it out at one point back in the day. Looking for the original source of this quote has proven to be quite fruitless, and I'm not going to go on a 16-hour road trip just to go back and confirm it for myself. However, I don't think that's necessary. A good chunk of Bidall's 5-decade career revolved around creating educational resources on these topics, and it's not hard to find her credited in various curriculums and lesson plans meant to be used at multiple different levels of development, from public school to professional workplace training, discussing racism and equality and other similar topics. One of these educational resources is Education and Racism, an Action Manual. It was published in 1973, commissioned by the US federal government for use in anti-racism training programs given to federal employees. In this manual, Bidall's elusive book is directly quoted, stating, "Racism is racial prejudice, the belief that one's own race is superior to another race, combined with the power to enforce this bias throughout the institutions and culture of society." Considering that Bidall heavily contributed to this manual, it's safe to assume she's probably quoting herself accurately. This idea is reinforced a few pages later. In the United States at present, only whites can be racists, since whites dominate and control the institutions that create and enforce American cultural norms and values. This is not to say that blacks or other third world peoples could never be racists, that they do not have the capacity to hate, or to develop anti-white norms and standards. To say so would be dehumanizing and racist. The point is that in the United States at this time, blacks and other third world peoples do not have access to the power to enforce any prejudices they might have, so they cannot, by definition, be racists. Racism equals racial prejudice plus power. It would be very difficult at all for any individual to be racist by himself. If everyone just had his own individual racial prejudices, which were never reinforced by society, racism would not exist. But when those individual racial prejudices are reinforced by the culture, we then have institutional racism. Thus, all white individuals in our society are racist. Even if a white American is totally free from all racial prejudices, he remains a racist, for he receives benefits distributed by a white racist society through its institutions. Most of these benefits are so deeply embedded in the matrix of our white being, individually and collectively, that it's very difficult to become aware of them. Whites must simply accept the fact that in our society, they are racist. Now, I do have a lot to say about this stuff. We'll get back to it later in the video, but in the middle of that block quote is the shorter version of the argument that is regularly used online today. Racism is prejudice plus power. I've seen it as racism equals racial prejudice plus power. I've seen it as racism equals prejudice plus institutional power. I've even seen it formulated as racism equals privilege plus power, in order to cover softer forms of racism, where no prejudice from the white person towards the black person even exists, but the white privilege is still present. It's here that I need to point out, this definition is stipulative. A stipulative definition is when a currently existing word is given a new specific meaning, for use within a specific argument or context. This new definition is not meant to replace the general use of the word. In fact, depending on the argument or context, it might be fully contradictory to the general use of the word, while nonetheless still making sense in its specific use case. Because of this, a stipulative definition can neither be correct nor incorrect. It is only different. This brings me to my first real objection to Jaffe and Mercante's position. Their insistence that their definition of racism is the true definition.
You can't be racist against white people, which is technically accurate,
is just incorrect. Beidel originally created this definition for use within her own work, and despite that niche use, it is propagated across progressive spaces, with the original context attached. Progressives generally don't know where it came from, or why it was first put into use. The original definition of the word racism, as we saw back with Pratt who coined it, did not talk about power at all. Okay, well, a prog might say the origin doesn't really matter. The definitions of words change all the time. New ideas take form and need to be described. So who cares what racism used to mean? The power plus prejudice definition has utility, so that is what racism is now. I understand that argument. Obviously, access to some form of power can grant an oppressor extra capability to act on their target. But it turns out that, even from a progressive point of view, let alone a normie one, there's actually a lot of problems with P plus P. Yes, that is a common shorthand for the idea, because prejudice plus power is really clunky to say repeatedly, and also because, although Beidel's innovation initially only referred to racism, progressive activists noticed similar power dynamics working within other forms of bigotry. You can find variations like sexism is prejudice plus power, or ableism is prejudice plus power, whatever. Eventually, a universal form of this equation was distilled, indirectly, by the black feminist critical theorist activist Kimberly Crenshaw: oppression equals prejudice plus power. If her name sounds familiar to you, it's because I spoke about her briefly back in my video on the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci. In fact, I actually got some things wrong about her ideas back then, so let's quickly give the topic a fresh run. Gramsci, the leader of the Italian Communist Party, developed the theory of cultural hegemony. The ruling class of society shapes the culture. Beliefs, perceptions, explanations, values, norms. In this way, the worldview of the ruling class becomes the dominant ideology of the entire society, including its underclass, who are indoctrinated to act against their own interests by their inculcation into this ruling culture. It was Gramsci's view that before the workers could engage in a direct revolution against capitalism, like they did in Soviet Russia, which he called the War of Maneuver, they first had to generate a working class intelligentsia that would promote a counterculture to combat the dominant culture in the minds of the proletariat, which he called the War of Position. Gramsci and the Hungarian Leninist György Lukács, which is a name I still can't pronounce, were both active in Vienna's socialist scene in 1919. And although they never met, a mutual friend introduced Gramsci's ideas to the space. A German Jewish intellectual named Max Horkheimer was heavily influenced by Lukács, who in turn was heavily influenced by Gramsci. In 1926, Horkheimer was a professor at the University of Frankfurt, and in 1930, he took over the university's Institute for Social Research, which before him was an orthodox Marxist think tank of little note. Horkheimer combined the group's orthodox Marxian socialism with other disciplines, like the newly emerging psychology and sociology of Freud and Weber respectively, as well as Gramscian socialism. All of these ideas were mixed together and utilized to not only analyze power, but also critique and transform it, to show how access to power can fundamentally change behaviors or beliefs that are otherwise identical. Horkheimer summarized his ideas in the essay Traditional and Critical Theory, which gave the emerging school of thought its name, critical theory. The institute evacuated from Germany after the Nazis took power, due to its members being Jewish or socialist, or sometimes both. In the US, they continued their work, re-establishing a group at Columbia University known colloquially as the Frankfurt School. They were highly influential in America during the New Left period of the 60s and 70s, which saw the rise of feminism, black nationalism, and gay rights. The now aging critical theorists mentored a variety of young left-leaning revolutionary intellectuals, including a group of lawyers who sought to apply the framework to the emerging body of civil rights law in the United States. This is the origin of critical legal theory or critical legal studies. But this state of affairs didn't last beyond the 1970s. The original Frankfurt School members had aged out of the system, and critical theory was in decline due to Ronald Reagan. Not because he outlawed it or anything like that, but because of the ideological shift within the right that Reagan championed. American politics had been dominated by New Deal progressivism up until this point. The old right wing was made up of religious traditionalists, Puritans, authoritarians. They were strictly non-interventionist and regionalist, believing not only that America should simply ignore the rest of the world, but that individual states, and even smaller levels of organization like regions and towns, should remain as closed off from outsiders as possible. They were capitalists, but only somewhat. They distrusted large corporations, supply chains, and international trade due to their regionalist stance, and they viewed localized, agrarian, and artisanal trade as the only real form of capitalism. This old right, which the right-wing political theorist Paul Gottfried called paleoconservatism, the suffix paleo meaning old obviously, had basically been completely destroyed by the repeated electoral successes of the left. But Ronald Reagan was not a paleocon. He shared some of their values, like his support for capitalism and Puritanism, but he was resoundingly pro-intervention. Reagan was a neoconservative, neo meaning new, also coined by Gottfried, a new group of right-wingers who had split off from the old right during the Vietnam War after they came to believe that America's policy of containing the Soviet Union, rather than directly confronting them, would simply lead to the slow creep of communism everywhere. Unlike the paleocons, who simply wanted to shut themselves up behind a wall North Korea style, the neocons wanted to actively project American values, American culture, and when needed, American force, to directly combat communism worldwide, rather than stick their heads in the sand and hope it went away. Part of this meant international capitalism, free trade, cooperation between Western allies, and it's for this reason that the neocons, the new right, are often called right-wing liberals. Electorally, Reagan and his neocons utterly destroyed both the New Deal left and the paleocons, leading to the Democrats adopting some of their more successful measures under Clinton, and neoconservatism became the dominant right-wing ideology in the West up until the election of Donald Trump. But one really important view that Reagan brought with him to the right was civic nationalism.
You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever close the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost.
I spoke about this before in my video on ethnicity, but I'll give you a quick rundown. Civic nationalism, the view that a nation could be constructed on the basis of a shared political ideology, rather than a shared ethnicity or religion, was a cornerstone of the pre-1960s left, while the paleocons hated the idea, mainly for racist reasons. But the neocons openly embraced civic nationalism, as it was a natural partner with their pro-capitalist, pro-trade, and pro-intervention stances. Your race or gender or sexuality didn't really matter, as long as we were all united in the fight against communism. Which finally brings us back to Kimberly Crenshaw. In 1981, Crenshaw, as a law student, wanted to learn about critical legal theory, but her university was no longer offering critical legal studies courses. I will get into why a little bit later in the video, but in response, Crenshaw and other young academics got a hold of class materials and invited various guest speakers to put on a version of the class themselves in 1982. The collection of lectures given throughout that year were eventually published as Critical Race Theory, the key writings that form the movement. This is the origin of CRT, that right-wing boogeyman from a few years ago. Crenshaw's mentor originally called it racial realism, which stuck until people realized that was the same title the white supremacist David Duke gave to his own ideas. Crenshaw then changed the name to critical race theory, since it was a branch of the original critical theory from the Frankfurt School, and the new name stuck. And wouldn't you know it, within Crenshaw's contribution to that giant tome, you'll find Antonio Gramsci. The war of position, subverting the dominant culture with endless critique meant not to improve, but to demoralize. And the war of maneuver, direct revolutionary action meant to be taken after the dominant culture had been weakened enough by demoralizing its rank and file with propaganda. By the way, if you want to know why some anti-woke people online are extremely serious about getting DEI or LGBT shit out of video games or movies or TV, this political theory is why. These people might say stuff like, those transes are making my video games gay and black as I want to turn America communist, which on the surface does sound pretty ridiculous. But just because they might be unsophisticated and vaguely pointing at something that appears to be absurd, there is something that's at least kinda real underneath, something that can be traced back through left-wing political theory. Now that being said, the question, how many people are actually trying to do this when they put a gay character in your video game, versus how many people just think it's cool, well, that's still up in the air. But hey, I personally know it's more than zero at least, since I've actually spoken to 2 individuals who have directly said that is their goal. Anyway, in 1989, Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in her essay Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. Basically, her idea was, due to the intersection of race and sex, sexism for black women was different than white women, and racism for black women was different than black men. Sexism took on a different form due to race, and racism took on a different form due to sex. These are not simply additive effects, but transformative. Intersectional theory is taught within social studies today, and one common studying tool is the intersectional wheel, where demographics that have power are in the middle of the diagram, while oppressed demographics are on the edges, to physically show the difference between centering and marginalizing. And again, if this all looks or sounds familiar to you, think back to my What is Woke video. The definition of woke that I offered in that video was the application of the socialist lens to oppressor-oppressed group dynamics other than the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but also opposing groups like white and black, straight and gay, male and female, whatever. Considering that intersectionality is one branch on the tree of political theory that we can positively identify as Gramscian socialism, my definition of woke actually makes a lot of sense, not to toot my own horn too much. However, P+P isn't the only academic definition of racism that you'll find floating around right now. This is a page from some critical race theory curriculum, one of many currently in use in the United States. It's not the exact same worksheet that I was given in my Intro to Critical Theory class back when I was at university, but it's pretty close. This is a TLDR of what racism is in critical theory. There are 4 levels here, and each level is supported by the previous levels. The first is internalized racism. There are racist thoughts that you have, whether it's towards your own race or another race. The second is interpersonal racism. This is when you extend internalized racism out from beyond just yourself, where you act in a racist manner towards other people. White people can be interpersonally racist towards black people, and black people can be interpersonally racist towards white people. The third is institutional racism. This is when the laws or the policies or procedures of an institution are racist. So if a rule or something says that whites get an outcome and blacks get a different outcome, that is institutional racism. Institutional racism requires a person with internalized racism who acts on it through interpersonal racism to hold a position of power within an institution and use that power to project that interpersonal racism across the institution and not just towards one individual. The fourth is structural racism. This is when the stated laws or policies or procedures of a given institution are not actually racist, but downstream effects of previously abolished racism are still in play. The structure of society that remains after the racism is abolished still holds a racist shape. Structural racism is something like the afterimage of racism. What you'll notice is that although this worksheet does make P+P type arguments for institutional and structural racism, it does not for interpersonal racism. The view here is that each level of racism is still real racism, but the power calculation is different for each. Interpersonal racism requires very little power, making it unidirectional. This leads me to my second objection to Jaffe and Mercante's position. Their argument isn't actually a statement on whether or not racism is bad, though we all agree it is. Their argument is over what the label of racism actually points at. The rationalist Scott Alexander, in his article, Social Justice and Words, 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 gave a rebuttal to their position back in 2014. Why can't social justice terms apply to oppressed groups? There is no way to get a quicker reaction from someone in social justice than to apply a social justice term like privilege or racist to a group that isn't straight, white, or male. And then Alexander goes on to point out a bunch of feminist articles, which all constitute special pleading. This is 2014, remember. Trans activism and online socialism hasn't hit its stride yet. Alexander then says, I can't argue with this. No, literally, I just can't. There's no disputing the definitions of words. If you say that racism is a rare species of nocturnal bird, native to New Guinea, which feeds upon morning dew in the dreams of young children, then all I can do is point out that the dictionary and common usage both disagree with you. And the sources I cited have already admitted that the dictionary is wrong, and no one uses the word racism correctly, which by the way is exactly what Jaffe said. The critique here is that the definitions of words are ultimately arbitrary. However, if we speak with the intention of communicating knowledge to the listener, both the speaker and the listener have to use words that roughly point at the same concepts. If Jaffe and Mercante were to look at this critical theory worksheet, I don't think they would actually disagree with any of its contents. What the worksheet calls institutional racism, they would just call racism. And what the worksheet calls interpersonal racism, they would just call not real racism. They're not arguing over whether or not interpersonal racism is bad. They're simply saying it's not real racism. More formally, they're engaging in linguistic prescriptivism, as is anyone who insists that the progressive academic definition of racism is the actual definition and you're not using it correctly. Linguistic prescription is basically the view that there is a proper way to use language that should be culturally enforced. In a paper on the topic by the Croatian linguist, Mate Kapovic, he states that oftentimes, prescriptivism is a conservative social force, with the upper-class speakers of a language viewing their word choice, grammar, meaning, accent, and tone of voice as correct, proper, or cultured, while the lower-class way of speaking is uncouth or incoherent. In fact, related to our topic today, oftentimes in America, black vernacular was viewed as improper English, and its speakers were demeaned. However, since the rise of concerted anti-racist efforts from educators like Bidall or theorists like Crenshaw, a new form of linguistic prescriptivism has appeared on the left, commonly called politically correct speech, but it functions basically the same way. You've got big city progressives who tend to be more educated, more well-traveled, and more wealthy than small-town conservatives, and they're insisting that their use of language is the correct use, and those who don't agree are simply ignorant. Now, linguistic prescriptivism isn't all bad. Like I said earlier, if you need to transmit information from one brain to another, you have to ensure that the words each person's using point to roughly the same concepts for all involved. If everyone has wildly different meanings for each word, you might as well be speaking different languages at that point. This idea is codified in Grice's maxims, which lay out the 4 rules for honest communication. 1. Quality, which basically means don't lie. 2. Quantity, say just enough. Too little means that you're vague, too much means that you overwhelm. 3. Relation, stay relevant to the topic, don't wander off. 4. Manner, avoid being ambiguous. However, to go back to a well we've drawn from many times in this channel, the philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, famously stated that the definition of a word isn't how it's used. If I say the word racism, and I'm referring to interpersonal racism, that is what racism means when I say it. If Jaffe or Mercante say racism, and they're referring to institutional racism, that is what racism means when they say it. And going back to Alexander's essay, maybe somebody is using the word racism to refer to a species of bird. All definitions are true, since we're all saying the word. In Wittgenstein's view, we're just not talking about the same topic. So there's clearly a balance to strike here. Once again, a golden mean to follow. With no prescriptivism at all, we simply can't communicate. With too much prescriptivism, we stifle each other, ironically enough, often along intersectional lines like race or class. Therefore, communication requires some prescriptivism, just not too much. It's my opinion that when progressives like Jaffe or Mercante insist on a specific definition of the word racism as the true or only or real definition, it's because they understand there's an emotional, moral weight to that word in our culture, and successfully claiming it in such a way that only they can wield it against their enemies, and their enemies can't wield it back against them by appealing to the authority of academia is basically just a power game. They know the average person uses the word racism to refer to bigotry, which is differently than they'd prefer. And their reply of, actually you can't be racist against white people, violates Grice's 4th maxim. They know what the other person is saying, but they're doing a Mott and Bailey with the ambiguity that exists between the colloquial definition and their preferred definition of the word racism. However, my critiques of Jaffe and Mercante so far have not actually talked about the validity of P plus P itself, but rather the shell game they're playing with words and definitions. So let's actually tackle that next. And the best way to show how an idea might be wrong is to begin with those times that it might actually be right, paradoxically enough. Let's say a white guy and a black guy are hurling slurs towards each other. That's interpersonal racism, they're obviously both capable of it. Now let's say a white guy and a black guy both walk into a store, and the store employees decide to follow the black guy around but not the white guy, operating under the assumption that the black guy is there to steal stuff. That might be interpersonal racism between the employees and the black guy, but it's also institutional racism between the store as a corporation and the black guy, and also possibly the police and the black guy if they get involved. The increased level of power the corporation or the police can bring to bear on the situation does change the practical effects of racism, as they are able to do more damage to their target than a random person could on their own. So you know what? Fair enough. However, progressives fail to realize that dominant groups do not actually hold monopolies on power. If a white person were to walk into a black-owned business and be treated in a bigoted manner by that business, it would be a form of institutional racism, because within that dynamic, the black owner of the property has the power. If there's a dispute, the police will arrive and throw the white person out because it's private property, and if the police fail to do so, the black owner will go to court and win a handsome payout for his troubles. We can think of other examples too. Imagine a white racist school admissions officer who rejects black student applicants due to their race. This is obviously not only interpersonally racist, but also institutionally racist, as the admissions officer is wielding his power against the applicants. But a hypothetical black racist admissions officer rejecting white students would be just as racist, as he too is using the power of the institution that he represents. Now, there is a progressive counter-argument to my position here, and Mercante provided a portion of it during that stream.
Black people do not hold the keys to all the major systems of power. So
Right.
yes, you could have a Black person who's like, I fucking hate white people.
Yeah.
You could have anybody who says that about anybody.
Yep.
But whether or not they can use that hatred to affect the life of more, multiple white people or even one white person,
because simply they are white.
yes, they can't do that.
Right.
They can't do that. So I
Now,
mean,
answer me this. If
Yeah.
we lived in Wakanda, it would be different, correct? Then if you lived in Wakanda, you could absolutely be racist against white people.
well, yes, and well, if
If
then you have
Wakanda's
to,
on another planet.
Yes, yeah, that's what I was going
Right,
to say.
okay,
Yeah, because
okay,
if you're
the
having
connected-
inter
Yeah, but they don't
international
trade
travel,
with
that's
other
different.
people. Come on now, T'Challa, he's not into that. He's not doing deals with Elon.
This probably sounds quite similar to some of the stuff that Bidal wrote in that action manual previously. Maybe not the Marvel stuff, where all white people are racist because even if they are free from all prejudices, they receive benefits distributed by racist institutions simply because they are white. Let's examine how this logic plays out practically. If a white guy walks into a black-owned business and he's treated in a racist manner by that business, it's not actually institutional racism because the next power structure up, the police, is a white power structure. Although the black business wields some level of power over the white patron to enact his racism, the white police wield even more power over the black business. And this basically scales up in perpetuity. If black police officers arrive to the scene, well, their department probably has a white captain. If the captain's black, well, the mayor of the city is probably white. If the mayor's black, well, probably the state governor's white or whatever. As you go up the rungs of power, eventually you'll discover a white person who wields institutional power over the black people on the previous rungs, meaning that those black people do not truly have the power to actually be institutionally racist, because they're always kept in check by the white people above them. Anytime you might actually find an instance of legitimate anti-white institutional racism, it's not actually real, because if you zoom out one level, the next institution on top will be a white institution. However, Jaffe and Mercante actually take this idea further than Bidal did in her work. Remember, even by the P+P definition of racism, Bidal admitted back in 1970 that non-whites could be racist in countries other than the United States, where they dominate the power hierarchy and whites are a minority. But they didn't even give white people that.
If we lived in Wakanda, it would be different, correct? Then if you lived in Wakanda, you could absolutely be racist against white people.
Well, yes, and well, if
If Wakanda's on another planet.
Yes.
If institutional racism requires wielding the power of those institutions in order to enact your racism, then most people would agree that simply being an oppressed minority is enough, whether that's black people during America's slavery era or white people in Zimbabwe during Mugabe's anti-white purges. In both of these examples, the racial minority was oppressed with state institutions. Progressives solve this problem without admitting that anti-white institutional racism can actually exist in a non-first world context by appealing to the next level up on the hierarchy of power. In this case, that Mugabe was oppressed by the colonial system he inherited and the Western powers who keep it in place. So his race purges of ethnic Europeans are not actually racism. They are in fact liberation from racism, which by the way didn't go all that well for Zimbabwe in the end. This is why, in that video clip, they said that Wakanda has to be on a different planet for true anti-white institutional racism to exist. Because at the very top of the largest power structure that controls the entire planet, in their view anyway, geopolitics is actually a lot more complicated. At the top of it sit white men. They reject Bidal's carve-out for anti-white institutional oppression existing in their countries by appealing to this false notion that the United States wields total power over everyone and everything, and all other powers always bend to its will. And because America is a white power structure, the world's various smaller, non-white power structures are inherently oppressed by it. One good look at the world shows this is obviously false, but I don't expect progressives to understand, well, anything really. Additionally, this logic fell completely apart when Barack Obama was elected president. From 2008 to 2016, he was on the highest rung in the world. The leader of the most powerful and influential country on the planet was black. There was no possible higher rung of institutional power to appeal to. A lot of people asked at this point, can you be institutionally racist against whites now? And the reply from the radical left was still no, due to the still lingering effects of structural racism. This was often codified in a nebulous whiteness, where in the absence of a white tyrant at the top, white culture had to have taken root in the minds of black individuals, turning them towards whiteness and away from blackness, causing them to uphold white supremacy. A new wave of educational literature was developed during the Obama years, seeking to explain how this process worked, and it actually ended up being some of the most racist shit I've seen in a long time. Here's how it worked. You may have heard another commonly spoken progressive phrase once or twice: race is a social construct. On the face of it, this seems kind of absurd. Like, if you're a white guy and your white girlfriend has a black baby, don't worry about it, dude, race is a social construct. It sounds kind of ridiculous. But there's a more sophisticated form of the argument, that what we call race is a somewhat inaccurate stand-in for genetic diversity, the idea that humans have heritable traits, which we obviously do, and the inaccuracies of the stand-in are the thing that is socially constructed. Here's an example. Some humans have attached earlobes, others don't. Due to science, we've learned that whether or not somebody has attached earlobes is genetic. It's a trait passed down from parent to child. We've probably all seen both types of earlobe before and paid it no mind, because we have no social expectations linked to the concept of whether or not an earlobe is attached. It's simply a physical quirk. Now compare a similar aesthetic feature, single versus double eyelids. Some human eyes have 2 lids, others have only 1. And due to science, we've learned, just like with attached earlobes, that single versus double eyelids are genetic, passed on from parent to child. But unlike attached earlobes, single eyelids are considered to be one of the common aesthetic indicators that an individual is a member of the Asian race. And that comes with it assumptions and expectations, which, regardless of their accuracy with any one individual, are the product of narratives told about that race. When someone makes the claim that race is a social construct, the dumb people might mean that genetics have literally no effect whatsoever on you as a person. Yes, I've met people like this before. If you go deep undercover into far-left anarchist spaces, you always encounter crazy blank slate truthers. But the smarter individuals mean that the lines drawn between the races are based on arbitrary aesthetic markers. And even though they're heritable, they don't actually point at any difference in ability, and so the assumptions and expectations about the individual are what's socially constructed. In more practical terms, when a progressive says the phrase, race is a social construct, what they're saying is, the old racist stereotypes about black people being stupid, lazy, unmotivated, unreliable, all of that stuff isn't in black genetics. Black people are obviously capable of being the opposite of these things. Smart, industrious, competitive, punctual. You know, Protestant work ethic stuff. The stuff that makes up the positive stereotype about white people as a race. Even when individual black people do actually fulfill the negative stereotype about them, like with the whole colored people's time thing, or what the Boondocks lovingly call a nigga moment, they're not driven to do it by their genetics, like how some race realists believe that Africans have a so-called warrior gene that drives these behaviors or something. Rather, all of this is a part of a racial narrative that our society tells itself about the nature of black people. But it's not nature. Black people can be smart, industrious, competitive, and punctual, just as white people can be dumb, lazy, unmotivated, and unreliable, despite our culture viewing these qualities as racialized. All this stuff that I just laid out is what progressives used to believe, because it explained the nuts and bolts of how a white power hierarchy can keep black people oppressed by assuming that black people can't adopt any of these otherwise pretty positive traits, like intelligence or hard work or whatever. I say progressives used to believe this, because after Obama got elected, in progressive academia at least, all of that shit went out the window. Progressives are ideologically devoted to the outcome of anti-white institutional racism being impossible. And with a black man at the top of the ultimate power hierarchy holding dominion over the entire planet, in their view anyway, another phantom source of anti-black racism had to be present to justify their claim of continuing white domination. And that source was the nebulous whiteness, sometimes called white culture or white supremacy culture. Gone were the old days of progressives pushing back against racializing certain behaviors. Oh no, they fully leaned into it. But instead of agreeing with the legitimately racist claim that black people simply could not embody certain white traits due to their supposed genetic inferiority, instead progressives claimed that when black people did embody these white traits, they had become white themselves. They were acting white, or they were perpetuating whiteness with their behaviors and choices. Like with intersectionality and P+P before it, this idea took off in academic spaces and began to be taught in schools and workplaces across the Western world. Probably the version of this idea that I see posted online and mocked most regularly is this infographic: Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture in the United States. White dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over time, and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, we have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color. So, fellow shitlords, let's educate ourselves. What constitutes white culture? What are these supposed behaviors that, if people of color perform them, are somehow internalized white supremacy? Well, here's the list. 1. Rugged individualism. Self-reliance, independence, personal control. The individual is the primary unit. 2. Family structure. Nuclear family, mother, father, kids. Husband's the breadwinner, wife is the homemaker and subordinate. Children should have their own rooms. Okay. 3. Emphasis on the scientific method. Objectivity, rationality, cause and effect. 4. History. Based on the European immigrant experience. Focus on the British Empire, Greek, Roman, Judeo-Christian traditions. 5. Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before play. 6. Religion, Christianity, intolerance of polytheism. 7. Status, power, and authority. Wealth, the job is who you are. Respecting authority, valuing property. 8. Future orientation, planning, delayed gratification, progress. 9. Time, scheduling, time is a resource. 10. Aesthetics, European, bland food, female Barbie attractiveness, male status and power attractiveness. 11. Holidays, Christian holidays and white male leader holidays. 12. Justice, English common law, protection of property, intention counts. 13. Competition, win at all costs, valuing action, aggressiveness, extroversion, decision-making, winner-loser dichotomy, majority rules but only when whites have power. 14. Communication, the King's English, written tradition, avoid conflict or intimacy, don't show emotion or discuss your personal life, be polite. So, I don't know if you took this list the way that I did, but a lot of this stuff is actually just pretty good. You know, qualities that anyone of any race should be, like self-reliant, objective, rational, hardworking. These qualities are mostly just positive qualities. It's not racism that they also come from white majority societies, or that white people disproportionately employ or embody them. These things would be good even if white people didn't do them. If this list is what whiteness is, then is blackness its inversion? For some of these things, like history or religion or holidays or aesthetics, that's probably not a big deal. That just comes down to personal preference. But are we really comfortable with fencing off as blackness stuff like perpetual dependency, lack of self-control, unstable family structures, broken homes, dysfunctional children, laziness, short-sightedness, poverty, unemployment, thievery, stagnation, indecision, emotional dysregulation, rudeness? This sounds pretty fucking racist to me. There is no way that this is what was intended by this theory, right? At the start of the video, we went down a rabbit hole to discover the origin of P+P, and it eventually led us back in time 50 years to Patricia Bidall, an obscure academic that nobody's ever heard of, but whose work set the focus of the entire conversation we're currently having. Discovering the origin of whiteness, or white culture, or white supremacy culture, is actually a very similar journey. An offshoot of critical race theory, called critical whiteness studies, is built on the idea that the norms of American society are whiteness, white norms, white culture. Because whites are the norm in America, American norms must also be white. The abnormal American is the non-white, so abnormal American practices are non-white practices. Bidall had many contemporaries, but it was ultimately her work that laid the foundation, and it's the same here. Meet Tema Okun. Her career is much like Bidall's. Okun's a lifelong educator and social justice advocate. She created a ton of anti-racist resource materials for schools and workplace training. You know the drill. In 2001, Okun published her most influential work, with the assistance of other activists, Dismantling Racism, a resource book for social change groups. This is a workbook meant to be utilized in tandem with a Dismantling Racism workshop, which was offered to schools and workplaces for many years by the company Dismantling Racism Works, of which Okun is a co-founder. As members of the company began to move on, eventually they made the resources available for free on their website. A lot of the people who used to have jobs in Dismantling Racism Works have since moved into other similar organizations, doing other similar work, including Okun herself, who is now head of the board at the UUSC, which is yet another social justice advocacy organization. The actual Dismantling Racism resource book itself, well, it's certainly a product of 2001. Using Comic Sans for the content of the book is certainly a choice. And hey, does their logo use the font for Banjo-Kazooie? A lot of the stuff in here we've already seen before. Power imbalances, institutional racism, P+P. Despite being published 30 years after Bidall's work, not much has changed. In tone, it's a bit less instructional and a bit more artsy. That's about it. However, the part of this book that we're interested in is the section on white supremacy culture. Here's how the chapter opens. This is a list of characteristics of, and antidotes to, white supremacy culture which show up in our organizations. These characteristics promote white supremacy thinking. They're damaging to both people of color and white people. Organizations that are people of color led, or a majority people of color, can also demonstrate many damaging characteristics of white supremacy culture. Okay, so implied with the use of antidote here is that the opposite of these white qualities are considered good by Okun anyway. Here are the 14 white qualities this time. Perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger or more, objectivity, and the right to comfort. These are the qualities that apparently make up whiteness. And according to Okun, black people perpetuate whiteness if they embody or value these things. Of course, she goes into detail in each one of these, but it's actually pretty similar to that infographic from earlier, so we don't have to get into it. There's tons of overlap. And here's the thing, it's not like there isn't some negatives on this list. Like, alright, either or thinking. Yes, it's bad when people dumb an issue down to a binary when it's more complex. Fair enough. The issue is calling all of this stuff white. Anyway, all that being said, these 14 points as white supremacy culture are now everywhere in academia. People have posted pictures online from a class or workshop they attended, where the 14 points appear in bullet form. Presumably the lecture explains each one. These 14 points are the basis for larger infographics like the one we looked at earlier, and many others, in the same way that Bidal's P+P was the basis for a whole generation of literature on racism. Okun gave a talk about her ideas in 2021 with yet another progressive advocacy group that she's a part of, Co-Creative. Against my better judgment, let's take a look at what she said. Oh wait, hold on. There's a land acknowledgement first.
I am joining from the traditional land of the Wintu people in what is now known as California, the unceded territory of nearly 200 tribal nations. I want to invite each of us to take a moment of silence reflection on that legacy.
Okay, after that there's a meditation segment.
So I invite folks to find our breaths at this moment and connect to our bodies in ways that feel comfortable to you. I invite you to take a moment to pause and take a few deep breaths at your pace. And that breath will serve as a reminder that you are here.
And then a poetry reading?
In a moment, I'll be reading from the words of Mickey Scott Bay Jones' Invitation to Brave Space. And I'll invite you to close your eyes or leave them open and follow along as you also read the words here.
When do we get into the talk, guys?
What a privilege to be here in this space with all of you today. What we're going to do now is I'm going to spotlight Tema.
Fucking finally. So here's the rundown of the Tema Okun story. Unlike Bidal, who helped create an entire industry of social justice education, Okun had been a student in that system for most of her life.
When I was living in the Bay, I also had the wonderful opportunity to go and participate in a series called the Challenging White Supremacy Workshops, led by another mentor named Sharon Martinez, who still lives in the Bay, and was doing these incredibly thoughtful and rigorous workshops about white supremacy. So I attended those.
That workshop is also available online, and it's the exact same thing as everything else I've read for this video. It's like they've just been regurgitating the same information into each other for decades now. After these workshops, she created the 14 points. And here's how that happened.
And then I went to a meeting, and I don't remember the meeting, but I went to something that was so frustrating. Everything about it was frustrating. And what I remember is that I came home, and without any books or notes or anything, I sat in front of the computer, and the characteristics, the article just flowed out through me and out onto the computer. I don't remember thinking about it. It was just like, this bothered me. Power hoarding. Either or thinking. And so it was just like my stuff coming out. But it wasn't mine. It was, it's like I had been influenced and informed by all these people.
Yeah, she got angry at a corporate meeting. That's where the list comes from. It's not from any sort of research or polling of people's attitudes or anything like that. She got mad during a business meeting and then vomited it all onto a page. And here we are 25 years later, living with the aftermath of it. Like I said earlier, some of this stuff that Okun included within white supremacy culture is actually positive. And she does position her anecdotes as solutions to this supposed whiteness.
When I showed it to Sharon, she said, you can't offer characteristics of culture without saying what you do about them. So she's the reason that I offered the antidotes.
So what does this mean for Blackness? Does it mean that Black people who do some of these positive things are acting white? Well, some academics seem to think so, even if they're not directly responding to Okun's work. Signia Fordham and John Ogbu published in 1986 the paper Black Student School Success, Coping with the Burden of Acting White. The paper begins with several testimonials from young Black students in the 70s and early 80s. We're talking like kids who are 10 years old or younger. Each time the story is similar. The Black students excelling at school, and the white teacher accuses them of plagiarism or cheating because of their legitimate racism towards Black people. As a result, the Black student becomes demotivated and associates academic excellence with white people stuff. This experience was apparently common enough among Black kids at the time that within Black American subculture, academic success became the prerogative of white Americans, and those Black Americans who excelled at school were acting white. It was not only bigoted white teachers, but also other bigoted Black people who would reinforce this cultural standard. The paper then goes on to use data from several American schools and cities to make the point that black students' lower than average success rates were not only correlated with having white racist teachers, but also with living in predominantly black environments where success was correlated with white people, and leaving the ghetto was viewed as a betrayal. Now, ever since Fordham and Ogbu's paper was published, it's received a lot of backlash from progressive academics, who basically call them race traitors. All of these replies mainly use the same arguments, so let's skim through just one of them. What does acting white really mean? Racial Identity Formation and Academic Achievement Among Black Youth by Vinay Harpalani, published in 2001. Harpalani presents new data showing that in the 15 years since the previous paper was published, black students no longer fall behind while within predominantly black environments. Well, okay, fair enough. That sounds pretty good. But then this paper goes off the fucking rails. Harpalani appeals to something called the Negra Sense Framework and its various stages of black racial enlightenment. Okay, Negra Sense is the process of becoming black, of developing a black racial identity. Apparently, several black writers have talked about this. William E. Cross Jr., in his book The Shades of Black, apparently describes the stages of black enlightenment. But unlike a lot of the other books and papers today, I haven't actually read this one, so I couldn't confirm it. He also published a paper on this idea, The Thomas and Cross Models of Psychological Negra Sense, a review. Yeah, he's literally reviewing his own work here. It's like Obama giving a medal to himself. The analysis by Thomas begins with an introduction to the concept of negromachy. Okay, I'm gonna get fucking banned, dude. Negromachy is, in Negra Sense theory, a hypothetical mental illness that afflicts black Americans. The symptom of this mental illness is when a black person's view of themselves is filtered through the dominant white lens, when they experience their own blackness as an othering from whiteness, rather than its own experience. In practical terms, this means black people holding themselves up to various white cultural standards. What are these standards? Well, Thomas and Cross never actually say. Nonetheless, Harpamani uses the Negra Sense framework to claim that Fordham and Ogbu just don't understand what acting white really means. In his view, it means Afrocentrism, the final stage of Negra Sense, where the black person is cured of his negromachy and is finally able to view himself as a black person independent of white expectations. Well, okay, what does that actually mean? Like, maybe I'm just fucking dumb, and all this is going over my head or something. Or maybe all these people are just retards, who aren't actually saying anything of value. Like, Harpamani is objecting to the idea of acting white, but then he basically describes the process of acting black. He's using different words than that, but I know what he's saying. But he doesn't even define what acting black is. What does it mean when he advocates for schooling to promote Afrocentrism? Because that is a cultural resource that black students require to succeed at school. Does it mean talking about famous black figures in history class? Sure, I'm okay with that. But his writing doesn't sound like he's advocating only for representation in that way. It sounds like he believes black students need a completely different schooling experience to succeed because they are black. That there is something natural, essential in the black person that means white schooling just won't work for them. But neither he, nor Cross, nor any of the other people cited in any of these papers ever actually get around to describing what this blackness entails. For all of their talk about not defining blackness in relation to whiteness, that is all they do in any of these papers. The only possible implication for all of this is that blackness actually is just defined in relation to whiteness. It is actually just the antithesis of whiteness in the minds of these activists. And so my original hypothesis was correct. The whiteness culture that came from Okun's work, with all of those pretty good qualities, the opposite of those things, with all of their pretty bad qualities, is what blackness is. Which means that Fordham and Ogbu are correct. Black people who embody these positive qualities are seen as acting white. These people have taken a set of legitimately positive behaviors, placed them in a box they call whiteness, racializing them as for white people, even though black people obviously have access to them, and then a person who performs these behaviors is perpetuating whiteness, which is racist, even if they're black, or Asian, or Indian, or whatever. Because these behaviors have been racialized by the progressive movement, non-white people can perpetuate white supremacy simply by working hard or being punctual. And yes, I do have an example of this logic playing out in real time.
Do you believe that you have a different relationship with the social and political systems in society based on who you are? You are a white, I'm assuming middle class Asian American.
He must have misspoke, right?
White presenting, I should say.
You know what, dude? Mad props for the double down. Call him a fucking cracker, man. Fucking go for it, dude. What?
So you're white.
I'm white presenting?
Wait.
What?
What?
A white presenting Asian.
What the heck?
Let me rephrase that.
Can you look at me right now? This is what. No.
I can simplify that for you. I can simplify that for you if that upset you.
We've gone down, what is it now, 3 rabbit holes so far in this video? Let's come back up for air. You can't be racist towards white people because P plus P. Even when a black power structure exists and oppresses a white individual, a superseding white power structure serves to dominate it, meaning black people can never truly have institutional power. And even when there's a black person at the top of the superstructure like Obama, P plus P is still in effect because it's not enough for a black person to be in a position of power. If they haven't yet decolonized their mind, if they're still perpetuating whiteness with their thoughts and actions. And, as this rabbit hole's revealed for us, what perpetuating whiteness actually is just a series of positive, productive, pro-social behaviors that most people agree are good things to do, regardless of race. This is all incredibly fucking bigoted, and leads to instances where black people are accused of acting white or being white simply based on their behaviors or their beliefs or their views. And yet, despite how genuinely awful it is, this theoretical innovation was necessary for the Progressive Project, due to their ideological devotion to the outcome that it is impossible to be institutionally racist against white people. In essence, because white progressives don't want to give up their own self-guilt, black people have been painted into a corner. In order for black people to take positions of importance in society, they'll have to do at least some of these positive so-called white behaviors. It's as if the progressive movement has defined the true, authentic black experience as failure, and black people who rise above that station lose their black card, I guess. I think this is why at least black conservatives found Biden's "you ain't black" comment to actually be pretty bigoted.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump.
It's not just that it was a white guy declaring who counts as black, though that did lead to some pretty funny memes. It's also that, from the point of view of the black conservatives I've spoken to at least, they understand that white progressives have racialized positive and negative sets of behaviors. It came off to them like they were required to perform the negative set, before progressivism, the political movement that claims to speak for their rights, would actually accept them as what they are. Just so we're clear, I'm not saying that I think Biden intended any of this in that clip. I'm just describing how the black conservatives that I've spoken to have said that it made them feel. Oftentimes, they would describe this feeling with the phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Or if they're a bit edgier, they'll say they've left the Democrat plantation. But in both cases, they're appealing to the same basic idea, that the old school antebellum South Democrats bundled their racial superiority with hatred, and nowadays Democrats bundle it with pity instead. Here's what they mean. The culturally constructed view of black people as uneducated and poverty-stricken once served the interests of past white racists in their oppression of black people, as they viewed them as incapable of self-improvement. But nowadays, when white progressives took all the behaviors that black people, or any people, could use to self-improve and racialized them as whiteness, what they've essentially done is locked self-improvement away from black people. And so, any black person who self-improves is no longer black. In this new way, black people are once again considered incapable of self-improvement. The white progressive isn't acting out of hatred of black people, but hatred of himself, of this sense of white guilt. And yes, it comes with benefits. The oppression of black people serves the interests of white progressives, who gain social clout for flagellating themselves in public over the sins of their ancestors, and who also make a lot of money talking about, writing about, and educating others about racism. Once again, I'm not saying that I believe this. Rather, this is how black conservatives view the white progressive stance on race, as a combination of guilt and grifting. By the way, there is a second smaller reason as to why Obama getting elected didn't allow for institutional racism against white people to exist within the progressive framework. Once again, think back to what woke actually means, applying the characteristics of socialism's class conflict to other oppressor-oppressed group dynamics. When you use the intersectional lens, the morality, beliefs, and behaviors of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat as economic classes are overlaid onto whites and blacks as racial classes. The dynamics of the class conflict between worker and capitalist become the dynamics of the race conflict between blacks and whites. Here's how this application filters down into the progressive belief structure. The proletariat and bourgeoisie have inherently opposing class interests that cannot be aligned. Similarly, whites and blacks have inherently opposing race interests that cannot be aligned. Negotiation between workers and bosses only serves to forestall the inevitable class war, as their natural class interests eventually reassert themselves, and the space created by their temporary bargain is used up. Similarly, negotiation between blacks and whites only serves to forestall the inevitable race war, their natural race interests eventually reasserting themselves as well.
Making a multiracial democracy is almost impossible. Most countries are fairly monoracial. China, Japan, England is about 9% black. We're a very multiracial country, and we're the only multiracial democracy that's gotten this far. Brazil is struggling like crazy to make theirs work, but the way they make it work is they just completely suppress 55% of the population. And also they just resist the idea of blackness at all. They just don't address race. They just ignore it. But what you're seeing is us fragmenting. And we were already fragmented. We had the Confederate States and the Union States were two different countries, really, that Lincoln forced to stay together. And so we're struggling to have one society, one culture, one set of mores, one set of values, which is so different. And living together is hard, and it's going to be hard because there's very little compromise between the two things we want to do in the world and what we want to be. I'm not sure that this experiment can work, to be honest.
The inherent power imbalance between workers and bosses makes true negotiation on equal footing impossible, and so should only be used as a tactic by the proletariat to gain breathing room and prepare for the next battle. Mutual respect, civility, or empathy are reserved only for class allies, and should only strategically and deceptively be employed against enemies. Similarly, the inherent power imbalance between blacks and whites makes true negotiation impossible, and should only be used by blacks to gain breathing room and prepare for the next race war. Mutual respect, civility, or empathy should only strategically and deceptively be employed against their racial enemies. Due to the exploitative nature of their relationship, the proletariat is inherently more moral than the bourgeoisie. Actions that would be immoral if taken by the bourgeoisie are actually moral if taken by the proletariat, due to their struggle for liberation. Similarly, blacks are inherently more moral than whites, and actions that would be immoral if taken by whites are actually moral when taken by blacks, due to their struggle for liberty.
Doesn't matter if fucking rapes happen on October 7th. Like, that doesn't change the dynamic for me even this much. So that's the other part of this problem that many people that can't contend with. Like, the Palestinian resistance is not perfect. They're not like so good. They have magical bullets.
The class war only ends when one class abolishes the other. The bourgeoisie cannot abolish the proletariat, as their existence requires continued extraction of value from the proletariat. But the proletariat must abolish the bourgeoisie to be free. The class war either continues in perpetuity with the exploitation of the workers, or ends with the destruction of the capitalists. Similarly, the race war ends when one race abolishes the other. Whites cannot abolish blacks, as white existence requires continued extraction from blacks, but blacks must abolish whites to be free. The race war either continues in perpetuity with black exploitation, or ends with the destruction of whiteness. And I feel like I've said this a dozen times this video, but I want you to know I don't actually believe in any of this bullshit. This is simply what happens when you overlay the various qualities of Marx's class conflict onto the conflicts between other oppressed and oppressor groups, like American race relations, which is what the intersectional lens does, and it is what people point at with the label of woke, even if they don't really verbalize it. Also, if you notice that a lot of this stuff actually sounds like the white supremacist belief structure, not the progressive belief structure, the actual answer is it's kind of both. It turns out it's not just a coincidence that critical race theory began as racial realism, the name for David Duke's philosophy. It's not that Crenshaw or any of her contemporaries or mentors were politically aligned with Duke or the KKK, obviously. Far from it. But in Duke's biography, he mentioned that he spent his youth politically disengaged, but casually agreeing with a sort of background libertarianism that permeates American culture. You know what I mean. You leave me alone, I leave you alone. We're all entitled to rights and privacy in our own lives. And that attitude changed in his teens after he read the book Race and Reason by the white supremacist activist Carlton Putnam. Putnam's work was a few years before Patricia Bidall's. His book was published in 1961, while Bidall didn't begin to formulate her own views on anti-racist action until the mid-60s. But despite being on completely opposite sides of the race question, they are nonetheless mirror images of each other. And it's hard to shake the feeling that Bidall's writing in direct reply to his ideas. When Bidall says, you can't be racist against white people because whites hold institutional power, Putnam agrees. Whites do hold institutional power. They should, because it's his view that they're superior. When Bidall says all white people are racist, Putnam agrees. It's good for white people, in his view, to be racist towards black people. They deserve it. When Bidall says America's institutions grant benefits to white people, Putnam wouldn't have it any other way. They completely agree on the description of the then current situation, but where Bidall identifies problems, Putnam simply thinks they're good. David Duke's own writing is heavily influenced by Putnam's, and as a result he ends up being a mirror image of Crenshaw, following similar logic and coming to similar conclusions, except once again where Crenshaw says it's bad, Duke says it's good. Both Duke and Putnam identified the influences of socialist theory in some parts of the American civil rights movement, but neither of them seem educated enough to be able to directly point to Gramsci or Horkheimer or whoever. They just handwave at the whole thing and call it all Bolshevik, appealing to the Red Scare mentality of the time. The point I'm making is, in the eyes of the white supremacists, the white ethno-state cannot be established with the presence of blacks anywhere in the hierarchy. Obviously not at the top, but also not in the middle or bottom either, as they will inevitably be subversive elements, acting in the interests of their own race and not the white state. And some of them even believe that contact with non-white peoples through trade will inject a foreign power incentive into their society, since if you're trading with someone, that means you want what they have, and your desire becomes leverage over you. Therefore, a truly white society, in their view, must be free of all non-white influences. All things must be oriented towards the white. And yeah, this is a lot like how Jaffe and Mercante talk about Wakanda, if you unpack the subtext of that short clip. Now that you know all of this, listen to it again.
Black people do not hold the keys to all the major systems of power. So
Right.
yes, you could have a black person who's like, I fucking hate white people.
Yeah.
You could have anybody who says that about anybody.
Yep.
But whether or not they can use that hatred to affect the life of multiple white people or even one white person
because simply they are white.
yes, they can't do that.
Right.
They can't do that. So I
Now,
mean,
answer me this. If we lived in Wakanda, it would be different, correct? Then if you lived in Wakanda, you could absolutely be racist against white people.
well, yes, and well, if
If Wakanda's on another planet.
yes, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay,
Yeah, because
okay,
if you're
you're
having
connected. But they don't trade with other people. Come on now, you know T'Challa, he's not into that.
It's the same logic. A truly black society cannot have white leaders or white subversives among the ranks, and it cannot even trade with whites because that creates leverage. Whether they know it or not, the natural end result of their logic is a black ethno-state with black institutions. It's extreme black separatism to the point of living on a different planet in order to escape the creeping white influence. Simply having a black leader is not enough. As per their theory, Obama perpetuated whiteness with his actions, and white subversives within the ranks sabotaged any potential emerging racial consciousness Obama may have had. I'm not making the claim that Jaffe and Mercante agree with Duke or Putnam. They're mortal enemies for sure, but their philosophy is descended from the same framework, and they arrive at the same endpoint: racial segregation, except this time make it woke. Considering that I'm a liberal, not a progressive, not a socialist, not a white nationalist, not a black nationalist, I think that integration is the better goal, not segregation, not even woke segregation. My views are more in line with Ronald Reagan's civic nationalism and liberal colorblindness, where race simply does not matter to me. This is my third objection to Jaffe and Mercante's position. Whether they intend it or not, their strict adherence to P+P, following that logic to its natural conclusion, leads to a ton of positions that are incredibly racist, not just against white people, but against black people as well. As black people continue to reach the upper echelons of society, the activists who dogmatically hold on to P+P have to twist themselves into increasingly more complicated pretzels to keep the ideology together. And in reality, they're both hateful and nonsensical.
And across different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well, David, you know, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the privilege of.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get into it.
Ariva, I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay, then I stand.
See, you went to white privilege. This is the falsehood in this. You went immediately with an assumption. Your people, obviously, or you didn't look. You're talking to a black man who started out in rock radio in Boston. Our skin is an organ. It doesn't think, it doesn't formulate ideas. Let's look at it that way and go back to the ideas in our head, the ideas in our mind, and the things we need to discuss.
So here's the thing. Let's look at the whole issue in particular. You had a set of beliefs that she just assumed made you white because you believe what?
Because I was talking about law and process and due process. To be fair, we had a long conversation, probably about 12 minutes or so, going into this portion of my interview with her. And it was a fair exchange of ideas. We were talking about issues where we agree, disagree. Then I talked about qualifications. I'd been through different genres in radio, as you guys know, rock, urban, hip hop, you name it. And I've been through different genres in talk. And it was because I did the work, and that's why I made the qualification statement. But being on Patriot Radio with me, and being on a conservative talk station, well, I must have been white.
But okay, maybe Jaffe and Mercante don't actually subscribe to that whole white behaviors part of progressive ideology, where individual black people can still perpetuate whiteness by, working hard or being on time. Fair enough. There is still nonetheless a core logic problem with P plus P, and it's colloquially known as the single cause, single solution fallacy. In the article, An Examination of Anti-Racist and Anti-Oppressive Theory and Practice in Social Work Education by Marie Macy, a sociologist, and Eileen Moxon, a social worker, both from the University of Bradford, they write, "The view that racism is an attribute of the monolithic category of people termed white, who hold all the power in society, is equally confused and confusing. At one level of abstraction, it is true that a certain sector of the white male population holds much of the economic and decision-making power. It is also true that some members of this group are statistically likely to be racially prejudiced. However, though this knowledge should inform education, it has limited utility in the everyday lives of black and white people. For example, if a Pakistani Muslim male refuses to be treated by an African Caribbean or an Indian Hindu female for reasons which, if articulated by a white Christian, would be condemned as racist, one has to ask, what is the point of denying that this refusal stems from their racist or sexist or sectarian motivations? Similarly, if one compares the structural position of a white homeless male with that of a black barrister, would the statement that only whites have power make sense or be acceptable to either of them? These anti-racist approaches are atheoretical, and thus closed to the canons of scientific evaluation. And because the discourse itself prohibits the open, rigorous, and critical interrogation, which is essential to theoretical, professional, and personal development. What's being said here is that P plus P really only works if all white individuals are a part of a monolithic block, the white race. But it's obviously unreasonable to think that by being a member of that demographic, by simply having white skin, white individuals are granted access to the institutional power that can be used to abolish racism. The assertion that all whites are racist, which Jaffe himself makes at one point,
all white people in America are racist,
devalues the contributions of individual white people who are themselves anti-racist. Going down the P plus P path leads to racism having a single cause and a single solution, neither of which is true. Racism does not exist solely due to prejudiced white people wielding power. In fact, oftentimes it's the lack of power that creates racism in the first place. The curator of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, David Pilgrim, had this to say on the topic. By the time I was told to attend classes at junior high, about 16 years after desegregation, most of the local white power structure had reluctantly conceded that school integration was legal and inevitable. Despite this, many of the whites that lived near or attended the school were intent on keeping us out. There were fights, black students against white students, and white parents and friends against black students. We didn't ride buses to school. Instead, we walked from our all-black neighborhoods near Highway 45 through the white neighborhoods that surrounded the school. Along the way, people threw stones at us and we threw stones at them. We were cursed at and we cursed back. The people who threw stones and slurs at us were pitiable, with a level of poverty that Americans often associate with so-called third world countries. They were some of the economically poorest people in the nation. One could argue that although they lacked power, they nonetheless had white privilege. I would argue instead that they were marginalized in ways similar to how minorities of color are marginalized. They worked jobs that paid starvation wages, and they were poorly educated. They did not have the power and privilege of middle-class respectable whites, and as a result, they were similarly dismissed as trash by other whites. Despite being white, they were stereotyped as white others, nasty, lazy, ignorant parasites. To argue that one must have power in order to be a racist is to suggest that these people were not racist. A different explanation is that his poverty, his lack of power, made him susceptible to racism. This time the thesis is inverted. It's not that true racism is prejudice plus power, but rather prejudice develops due to a lack of power. And if you look around nowadays, this is pretty obvious, isn't it? Racism is more likely to be found at lower rungs of society. The upper class, people with access to resources, good education, good social connections, all the things that lead to true institutional power. These people actually tend to be quite egalitarian in their social beliefs nowadays, generally because they've had access to a wider variety of life experiences. Meanwhile, poor people, drug-addicted people, people who can't afford their houses, or who have cars rusting out in their front lawns. Do you think these guys have traveled around the world? They've probably never traveled more than one town over. Bigotry is probably most prevalent from this class of people, the destitute small-town redneck, and not the educated cosmopolitan progressive. It's frankly a ridiculous notion that somehow the lowest among us have access to some hidden reserve of power that even the richest black man can't grasp solely due to his skin color. It is an idea that does not map onto reality. Pilgrim continues, definitions of racism have become battlegrounds. I've attended academic conferences where it was professionally chic to accept definitions of racism that only focus on white privilege or dominant group privilege. In chats with scholars, many of them white, I heard a disdain for social scientific, especially psychological definitions of racism that characterize it as an attitude. For those who share this disdain, racism could only be viewed as an organized system of group privilege, and since blacks collectively lack that privilege, they can't be racist. This tautological reasoning remains problematic for me. The lack of power doesn't mean that minorities can't be racist. It means rather that a minority does not have the same or as many opportunities to hurt the majority group. The inequality faced by blacks does not mean that they individually cannot be racist. Indeed, much like the whites who threw rocks at me in the 1970s, it makes holding racist views and discriminating when possible against whites more likely. Pilgrim caps his essay off with MLK's famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," to really hammer his point home. Power be damned, definitions be damned, if you hate somebody based on their race, you are a part of the problem. There are other perspectives that view P+P as too simplistic as well, including some from critical race theory itself. In 1990, the critical theorist Ambalavanur Sanavadan wrote the book Communities of Resistance, Writings on Black Struggles for Socialism, and in it, he made a similar observation about P+P. After the widespread race riots of 1967, 2 presidential commissions investigated the cause: the long-standing U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the newly created Kerner Commission, named after its chair, Governor Kerner. Oh yeah, if you watch my video on Trump's false elector plot, I went into how congressional committees function. A presidential commission is basically the same thing, just that it's part of the executive branch instead of the legislative. It still has all the same powers to subpoena witnesses, collect evidence, and make recommendations. The Kerner Commission's concluding report stated, "White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the blacks can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it." The second commission basically said the same thing in 1970. After these 2 reports dropped, a whole bunch of anti-racist literature began to spring up across the 1970s, as there was a demand within various sections of the American government for educational materials meant to train civil servants out of the old pre-civil rights era racism. This demand was filled by a whole bunch of freshly educated radical feminists and black activists, one of which was Pat Beidel, and her work ultimately won out among most others, becoming the foundation for future educational material on the topic, in much the same way that Okun's work would come to dominate the space 30 years later. However, it was Savanadan's view that Beidel's P+P formulation of racism simply siloed it off as a problem of white institutions, making it harder to actually confront and dismantle the realities of everyday racism. It made racism into a one-dimensional problem: whites on top, blacks on the bottom, with no room for nuance and no room for other racial identities. He concluded that the theory was the product of a privileged, well-meaning white woman who had no real experience with the topic of her life's work, though he was a bit more diplomatic than I'm putting him here. As popular as P+P is, or intersectionality or whiteness theory or whatever, there's a growing consensus that it's simply too black and white, pardon the pun, to be of any use. Some, like Pilgrim, believe P+P is used as a shield by legitimately hateful black and brown people to excuse their morally grotesque speech and actions against white people. Others, like Macy and Moxon, believe P+P serves no practical purpose because power is multivariant. Others, like Savanadan, believe P+P actually disarms the movement from tackling true institutional racism by being blind to non-whites who have some level of power. What unites them all, as well as many of the other black activists and intersectional feminists we've talked about today, is that they all levy the same criticism against each other. Despite how they all understand the necessity of tackling institutional racism, and how they all profess the desire to do so, they all claim that every other activist in the field is actually failing at that job. They each say, yeah, you know that guy over there? He's only tackling interpersonal racism in his writing, which means he's not actually doing the real work of combating institutional racism.
In DR Works, our frame is this, that racism is institutional and it's cultural and it's personal, and these things interweave. And Kenneth and I focused a lot on institutional racism, policies and procedures, and then we started moving to culture and understanding that if you don't change the culture, the standards and the values and the beliefs, then you can change all the policies you want and nothing really changes. And we see that in our national landscape. The article has been in circulation for 20 years, and I knew sort of just from hearing from people that it was in pretty wide use. And then when George Floyd was murdered, and there was such a spotlight put on racial equity work and racial justice work, it started being used even more. And I realized that that it really did need to be revised and added and updated. There needed to be a class lens. We needed to talk more about the intersections of white supremacy and capitalism, white supremacy and Christian hegemony.
And even as they all say this about each other, their corrections, the part where they say, okay, here's how you do it. Here's how you actually tackle real institutional racism. They all say the same thing as each other. It's all vague allusions to Afrocentrism and black liberation and defining blackness in relation to itself and not whiteness. Even though they never actually do that, they're always defining it in relation to whiteness. It's like these people have been spinning in a circle for the past 50 years, proclaiming progress while never actually making any, and constantly disarming actual real black people of the tools they need to make their lives better in any practical localized way. This is my fourth and final criticism of Jaffe and Mercante's position. P+P is just too simplistic. It flattens complex human relations into a simple binary of who is oppressed and who is privileged. Ironically enough, intersectionality claimed to do the opposite by taking into account multiple vectors of oppression beyond just racism. But even then, it's still not enough. There are a nearly infinite number of ways we're all privileged and oppressed for reasons beyond demographics or identity. The human experience is too complicated to be placed on a colorful wheel and have the total of your life calculated out and used to assign you into a progressive caste system. Intersectionality simply does not work. And after 35 years of it being used in schools, universities, and workplaces, academics are finally noticing that it's not fit for purpose. So, why is it that progressives like Jaffe or Mercante still cling to P+P, even though it's pretty much bullshit? Is it really just as I said in criticisms 1 and 2, that wielding language as a weapon is useful for their political project? Well, yeah, it's probably part of it. Another part of it probably is money, maybe not for these two specifically. Like I've mentioned several times throughout this video, there is a financial incentive for a lot of these people.
As a person that is a racial justice educator, an equity consultant, you know, I was one of those folks that people scrambled and called last year to be like, help us be less racist, right?
They're getting paid to make educational materials. They're putting on seminars. They're teaching workshops. In a strange way, this has become a self-perpetuating industry. That's why, even as legitimate racism declines, they continue to redefine words or discover new microaggressions or whatever, just to keep things rolling. Oh, also for Mercante, it probably is just money too. After all, that seems to be her main complaint about YouTubers who talk about her. She doesn't like that they're making money for their work, just like she makes money for hers.
Money, print money, cash,
money, well,
capitalism, raise a bunch of money, more money.
But I think there's a third reason, at least for white progressives anyway. I think they actually do see widespread racial injustice where little may exist. There's a 2011 paper that can give us some insight into their point of view, titled Whites See Racism as a Zero-Sum Game. The research in this paper shows that white people tend to see racial equality as a zero-sum game more so than black people do. What this means is, on average, white people commonly hold the belief that as society gets less racist towards black people, it will also get more racist towards white people. In this zero-sum view, there's no non-racist option, where no race experiences racism. Instead, average white people perceive racism against them as increasing, as they see racism against black people decreasing. Now, in actuality, this isn't true at all. For example, according to GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, yet another progressive advocacy group, their data shows that strategies developed to boost black graduation rates also help to boost poor white graduation rates when implemented, while strategies designed to disenfranchise black voters back in the day, like literacy tests, also ended up barring many white voters. What this means is that class is more important than race, and the colorblind liberals have a point. But it also means that racism is not actually a zero-sum game, that you can actually improve the lot of one racial group, while not damaging the lot of another group proportionally. However, this view of racism as a zero-sum game, which white people statistically tend to hold, well, white people tend to hold this incorrect view regardless of their politics. Right-leaning whites, on average, view racism as a zero-sum game that white people are losing their rights as the status of black people improves. But left-leaning whites, on average, view racism as a zero-sum game that white people are winning, that white people are benefiting from the decrease in black status over time. Both of these views are incorrect, and the data shows that black people don't share either of them. On average, black people don't view racism as a zero-sum game. Their views are actually more aligned with the data, that you can actually assist one racial group without damaging another. What this means is, for white progressives like Jaffe or Mercante, or any other person who holds the view that racism is prejudice plus power, of which there are many, it's quite possible they hold this view because of their own incorrect understanding of how racism operates. The P+P definition of racism lends itself very well to the dynamics of a zero-sum game, where there must always be some level of racism within a system, and the only way to truly manage it is to distribute racism more or less equitably across racial groups. Again, I don't think these people would actually say this if you asked them, but it is where their logic leads. P+P reinforces simplified binary thinking about how racism actually functions. Ironically enough, this positions the so-called anti-racist white progressive as the white savior, the only one who is educated enough to save the poor, downtrodden black victim from his own internalized racism and his ignorance about his own status. This is the progressive version of the white man's burden, which, if you haven't heard of it, was the colonial era view that white people had an obligation to civilize non-white people by introducing them to European technology and culture, and push them into the modern era by incentivizing them to abandon their old, prehistoric cultural idiosyncrasies in the name of progress. It's a form of paternalistic racism, where once again, white superiority is paired not with hatred, but with benevolence. Like they just want to help out these supposed poor savages and teach them how to not live in mud huts or whatever. It was often used as a cover for more overtly damaging forms of racism. In fact, think back to the start of the video, where Pratt first coined the term racism. That was an instance of the white man's burden. He explicitly said, kill the Indian in him and save the man, because he and others like him believed that more advanced peoples had a moral obligation to enlighten less advanced peoples. Despite the appeals to progress here, a lot of these initiatives were just a cover for racial abuse. And the progressives of today have their own white man's burden. In their view, white people are simultaneously guilty of oppressing black people, but also responsible for the creation of the tools which will liberate black people. As a result, white progressives spend a great deal of time and effort publicly debasing themselves, groveling and apologizing at the feet of the black movement, and of course gaining clout and money for their troubles. All the while, other white people who refuse to participate in this ritual are shamed and attacked, while those black people who refuse to participate are treated like they need to be uplifted and enlightened in the name of progress, just like Pratt's Indian. However, even black leftists have recognized that this performative white guilt is just another form of racism. Audre Lorde, black lesbian activist, stated in a speech given on a panel titled The Personal and the Political during a feminist conference in 1979, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Lorde is asking, what does it mean for liberation if the tools of whiteness are used for liberation? And her answer is, it is never truly liberating. What Lorde is saying here, once again, is that blackness needs to be defined not in relation to whiteness, black people need to be free from white expectations, Afrocentrism, etc., etc. But this time she gives us a tiny clue pointing the way forward, the master's tools. Now, think back to those infographics on whiteness, that nebulous force that apparently overtakes successful black people and keeps white power in the dominant position. These attributes are the tools of whiteness, which is how non-white people can still embody whiteness. They can still be white supremacists by wielding these tools, according to the progressive anyway. If the master's tools will not tear down the master's house, then acting white will not liberate black people from white supremacy. But also, a good chunk of anti-racist activism also originates from white people, like how white subversives in a black power structure disrupt black power. White ideological ancestors within black activism also disrupt that activism. In a strange way, utilizing P+P or white supremacy culture in black activism actually perpetuates whiteness, because those are the master's tools. It is viewing black liberation through the frame of the white savior, which, if you're a conspiratorial type, you might think is the true purpose behind the whole thing. The current state of affairs within professional black activism right now appears to actually be in the interests of the activists. White activists get to show how moral they are by publicly debasing themselves for the crimes of those who look like they do, while black activists get to feel like they're helping uplift their community by confronting the legacy of a legitimately terrible history, all the while making a getaway with tons of money. Of course, if you notice the profit incentive, you're a racist, or a race traitor depending. Since these activists are a part of blackness, when they enrich themselves, they're enriching blackness, while opposing their get-rich scheme is opposing black people. But even if it isn't just all about the money, even if they believe what they're doing is good, it's still not. Obviously, most of what we talked about today is complete fucking garbage. Obviously, it's not good to racialize positive behaviors as whiteness or call for racial segregation, even if you're doing it for woke reasons.
I also say that I claim only the intention, not the result.
Your intentions do not make these good things. Who you claim to speak for does not make these good things. So what's the solution? Because nothing we've covered so far actually has it. Well, here's another point in the conspiratorial column. If these people really were just political subversives, you might find the solution in what they explicitly deny, or outright hate in some cases. So let's go there next. Another P+P adherent is the sociologist Howard Winnett of U of C Santa Barbara, who published the paper Racism Today: Continuity and Change in the Post-Civil Rights Era back in 1998. It's mostly nonsense, but we do get a glimpse into the progressive thought process. Winnett admits that although he supports racism as P+P, it also made it impossible for the movement to gain any real traction or affect any real change. When Reagan and the neoconservatives swooped in the 80s, they pushed racism back to the individual level, which in his view is also inadequate. Winnett remarks that the liberal colorblind view of anti-racism is naive, and that his students, 90s university kids remember, who say things like, "a person just a person to me," well, they're problematic. They're engaging in a racist project by ignoring race, since that also means ignoring the effects of racism. Yes, this guy's a Gramscian socialist subversive. He even uses Gramsci's most famous quote to dog whistle in that direction. We all know what's going on here with the whole not seeing race is actually racist bullshit. But it is important to us that he pins the colorblind attitude of his students on the aftermath of the Reagan Revolution on the right. Think back like an hour ago at this point. The reason critical legal studies classes weren't being offered anymore by Crenshaw's time is because the liberal colorblindness that the Reagan years ushered in became the dominant culture across America. When Bayh-Dole made those initial educational resources, there was legitimate, overt, entrenched anti-black hatred in the United States. Nobody can argue that anything resembling colorblindness existed before racial segregation was abolished. And Winant argues the Reaganite tendency to say we're all one race, the human race, was a way to simply skip over all of the hard work of abolishing racism and jump right to the end where we're all racial equals. And in some cases that was certainly true. Old anti-black racists from the segregation era were still around during the Reagan years. Remember the racist teachers who helped reinforce the idea in black students' heads that academic success was a white people thing from that 1986 study? Yeah, they were still around, biding their time. Others would be a bit more sneaky about it. This time, they'd commonly say, we don't need these anti-segregation laws anymore. Who cares about race? As a way to mask their lingering anti-black racist views. To anybody who understands how subversives operate, their game plan's obvious. They claim racism is over, they lull the legal system into dropping its guard and repealing the relevant anti-segregation laws on the grounds that they no longer make sense because nobody thinks that way anymore. And then they push private society to take advantage of the new legal neutrality to establish segregation again. People on the outside of power commonly appeal to some sense of neutrality or talk about principles and hypocrisy, not because they care about those things, but because they're an easy way into power, and those stances go bye-bye once they win. This isn't unique to any political position. Anybody can do this. However, just because this did happen doesn't mean that everyone who appealed to liberal colorblindness was a closet racist. The progressives think so. That's why they think liberal colorblindness and other liberal qualities are actually covert white supremacy, and that liberalism is the handmaiden of fascism or whatever the fuck. And some actual white supremacists think so too. They're more than happy to dog whistle liberal neutrality for tactical purposes. But there are actually a lot of people who genuinely believe in that liberal colorblindness on its own merits. This is probably the most important long-term effect of the Reagan Revolution on race relations. It's not that it allowed white supremacists to sneakily return undercover, though that did happen somewhat. It's that liberal colorblindness actually became the dominant culture throughout the 90s and 2000s. When people of my generation say we don't see race, we mean it. We're not dog whistling to the white nationalists, no matter how much progressives claim we are. I have great nostalgia for those two decades, the 90s and 2000s. Not just because I grew up during them, but because the youth culture of those decades genuinely was colorblind. We actually valued integration. We actually did treat other people fairly. Roughly sometimes. We also enjoyed edgy jokes, but legitimate hatred was on the decline. We knew the difference between making a joke about race within our multiracial friend groups and actual racism. Progressives don't know that difference, and white supremacists are taking advantage of that fact. For all of the work of Bayh-Dole and Crenshaw and Okun and everyone else, weirdly enough, it was Reagan who actually managed to do what none of them could. The key to solving racism isn't any of this fucking bullshit we've mulled over for the past hour or so. It's true liberal colorblindness. That doesn't mean being blind to real racism when it appears, but it also doesn't mean seeing racism fucking everywhere like the progressives do. The anti-white insanity that Bayh-Dole spawned, and everyone descended from her propagated, was once a counterweight against legitimate anti-black insanity that dominated American culture. But those attitudes were largely vanquished before I was born. Without legitimate racists to offer them any true resistance, the zeitgeist swung far to the left. Too far, in fact. Resulting in an actual culture-wide demonization of white people, which in turn radicalized a new generation of younger whites into a white racial consciousness, not unlike what white supremacists like David Duke have been advocating for all along. We are at the point where anti-racist activists are actually helping to generate more racism than they're solving. At the end of the day, the claim that you can't be racist against white people because racism is prejudice plus power is an incorrect claim for a ton of reasons. 1, the word racist didn't originally mean that. 2, Bayh-Dole's P plus P definition was not meant to be a universal one. 3, P plus P contributes to an oversimplified version of racism, where progressive white saviors have a duty to uplift ignorant non-whites by immolating themselves. Other white people are bigots for not hurling themselves onto the pyre, and non-white objections or critiques are ignored, leading to a lesser understanding of real-world racism. 4, the claim that black people do not and cannot ever wield institutional power is just not based in reality. And finally, 5, let's be frank here, the main reason people even pull this definition out is to beat uneducated white people over the head with it. When a lower class white person is discriminated against by a black person who has other advantages over him, telling him, well, it's not racism per this academic definition, so if you complain about this, you're actually just a closeted KKK member. All you're doing is stifling legitimate grievances because of the race of the person making the complaint. Which, hey, to most normal people sounds pretty fucking racist. Now, are Jaffe and Mercanti the type of people who would simply wield an academic definition as a weapon in order to club their enemies into compliance, abusing both the colloquial and the academic concepts of racism in the process? Or are they actually racist themselves? Are they self-hating white people who think that their race, and all members of it, should be punished for the crimes of other historic people who look like them? Or are they just ignorant of the theories they're appealing to, bringing them up because it makes them seem smarter during these kinds of discussions, and they actually have no clue why they're wrong? Well, you know what? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to decide. What I do know is that, yes, you can be racist towards white people. And if you're a progressive listening to this, and you decide to go and insist that no, you can't, you're not actually convincing anybody of how much smarter you are. All you're doing is making white people, especially poor white people, a little bit more bitter. You're driving them just a little further into the camp of the white racial identitarians. And to me, that's actually pretty bad. So how about you guys just lay off, alright? You're making things worse for everyone with your nonsense. Okay, that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. This one took a lot to do, believe it or not, so please consider supporting the channel. I spent my time away doing a lot of reading, and I hope it shows. If you want to see more dev, something non-political this time, Naomi and I just dropped a review of the Sonic 3 movie over on the side channel. I'll see you over there, guys. Have a good one. I love you.